One aspect of physical development in infancy and toddlerhood is the development of sensory and perceptual systems. So, sensory systems involve those systems that allow us to experience sensation. So, sight, sound, taste, touch, and so on. And then, of course, perception is what our brains do with that information after that information makes its way to the brain. So when it comes to sensory abilities, those sensory abilities, of course, have to develop. And some of them begin to be present in the womb, but are not fully developed. Some of them are more developed at birth than others. And then in some cases, it takes a little while for those to develop after birth. So to begin with, the development of hearing and vision. Hearing is actually one of the first senses to be present in utero. It develops during that last trimester of pregnancy. And when babies are born, that sense, the sense of hearing, is actually their most developed or most advanced at that point. Now, of course, they don't hear perfectly at birth. Babies hear best those sounds that are in the range of human speech. So sounds that are either higher or lower in pitch, they may not detect as well, but those that are within the range of human speech, they tend to detect very well at birth. But again, their sense of hearing continues to develop in that first year. Vision is probably one of the least developed senses at birth. So the least mature sense at birth. And vision includes a number of different types of abilities. A couple of abilities that we're talking about here include things like visual acuity, color vision, also things like depth perception. Those are all visual skills that rely on that sense of vision. So to begin with, in terms of visual acuity, newborns can focus between 4 and 30 inches away. So what that means is what they see clearest is those objects or those stimuli that are in that range between 4 and 30 inches away from their face. And if you think about that, when a newborn baby is being cradled in the arms of a caregiver, that is about the distance from that caregiver's arms to the caregiver's face. And so that's about what they can see clearly. I have another slide here that we'll take a look at, and then we'll come back to that slide. In this slide, you can see sort of what babies see at birth in terms of visual acuity and how that changes over time during the first 6 months. It really isn't until babies are about a year old that their visual acuity is what it's going to be, or closer to what it is as they get on into childhood and adulthood. When it comes to the development of visual abilities, experience is really important. And this is another one of those areas where we see critical periods or sensitive periods. In this case, that term critical period or sensitive period refers to a period when children have to be exposed to a certain type of stimulation in order for certain abilities to develop. And I think we talked a little bit earlier when we were talking about teratogens, about how there are critical periods for exposure to teratogens and that kind of thing, but then there are also critical periods for the development of particular skills. And so with the sense of vision or sight, it does seem that babies have to have those visual experiences in order for that visual cortex to really develop and improve. And you don't really have visual experiences in the womb. So the that doesn't develop more until after birth. It also means that if babies are born with an issue that causes problems in terms of their vision at birth or makes it difficult for them to have those visual experiences, doctors and family members and other folks in that baby's environment have to act pretty quickly, because if that baby isn't allowed to get that visual experience, that sense of sight may not develop the way we want it to, or the way it should, in order for them to have full visual abilities. In your materials in this section, I have linked to a segment of The Secret Life of the Brain, and it's the first segment on the baby's brain. I'll post some information about that link, but if you start viewing that episode at about the 35-minute mark, you will see and you'll learn a little bit about the case of a baby who was born with cataracts, something that occasionally happens in babies, that clouded lens, and why they had to act quickly in order to allow that baby to have those visual experiences. So that's kind of an interesting piece to take a look at that I would encourage all of you to take a look at some point. Binocular vision relies on our two eyes working together, and that's something that develops sometime between 2 and 4 months of age. Depth perception, so the understanding that certain things are close up or further away, that's something that is usually present by about 3 months, but that doesn't mean that babies necessarily understand depth. Chances are you've probably seen in places, in addition to the textbook, information about how we have traditionally tested depth perception in babies. There's a device that's used that's called the visual cliff. You can see an image of that in the textbook. But again, that's another thing that requires experience. Babies have to have that visual experience in order to actually develop those visual abilities as they should. So other senses, taste and smell. Taste and smell seem to be pretty good at birth. They function at birth, and then after birth, babies' sense of taste and smell adapt pretty rapidly based on what they're exposed to. So those scents or tastes that are part of their environment, that are part of their diet and that type of thing. And part of the reason that we know that they can taste and smell from a very early age, or from those earliest days after birth, is that we often expose them to substances that have different tastes or that have different smells. And what we find is babies make some of the same facial expressions in response to those tastes and smells as we do as we get older. So you can see the little one in this piece who's having a taste of lime that must be pretty tart, and so she's making that typical sour face that you would expect babies to make. So another area of sensory development, of course, involves the sense of touch, and related to that, things like pressure, pain, temperature, those sorts of things. The sense of touch is pretty much intact at birth. We know that several of those newborn reflexes that we talked about earlier are stimulated by touch. At birth, babies seem to like to be held, and we looked a little bit earlier at the role of swaddling in comforting babies when they're trying to sleep or just when they're upset or whatever. But as babies get older, they begin to show a preference for certain types of touches over others. But again, this is another area where experience is important. And as we've talked about with the brain in general, having certain experiences seems to be pretty important when it comes to the development of the sense of touch. Now, in terms of pain and temperature are, of course, connected to touch, but there has been some debate about babies' experience of pain, whether or not they actually experience pain. Many have assumed that babies and that even the fetus can feel pain, but others say that that's something that doesn't come until a bit later. Pain is one of those senses that really depends a lot on perception, and so it may be that we can't really assess very well how babies are experiencing that pain immediately.